St. Mark's, may the peace of Christ be with you all. In the National Basketball Association, also known as the NBA, if your team wins the championship title, one of the perks that all of the players on the team will get is a championship ring. Here's a picture of the championship ring that the Los Angeles Lakers received after they won the title game back in 2020. It's not real actual size. This particular ring that all the Lakers got on the 2020 team for winning the championship title was actually the most expensive ring in all of NBA history, with each gold ring bearing 804 stones. Can you imagine that? Is there even enough room for 804 stones? There is, and that includes 15.5 carats of yellow and white diamonds and 17 purple amethysts, which make up the letter L right there in the center. What is the value of each ring, you might be wondering this morning? A cool $150,000. While there are other team perks for winning the national title, for example, there's a hefty cash bonus for each player, as well as bragging rights for the whole year, it's the championship ring that the players love the most. The NBA basketball player who currently holds the record for the most championship rings is a man by the name of Bill Russell. Here's a picture of Bill. Over his NBA career, Bill collected 11 championship rings, all with the Boston Celtics. Bill doesn't even have enough fingers for each one of those rings. Another famous basketball player you may have heard of, who also owns quite a collection, is Michael Jordan, with 6 rings, all with the Chicago Bulls. Then there's Magic Johnson, one of our local favorites, with 5 rings, all with the LA Lakers. There's also Kobe Bryant, who also has 5 rings, all with the Lakers. And then there's Larry Bird with 5 rings, who played with the Boston Celtics. How many of you have heard just a few of the names I just mentioned so far? Good. Mainly on this side, looks like we do have some NBA basketball fans among us. Well, it's not just the famous basketball players or the starters on the team who receive championship rings when their team wins the title. Every single player, from the famous starters all the way down to the unknown bench warmers, all get rings. Like Brian Scalabrine, in this next picture, who was on the 2010 Celtics when they won the championship. He also got a ring, kind of excited about that. Then there's Isaiah Ryder, who was on the 2000 Lakers team when they won the ring. When they won the championship, he also got a ring. There's Scott Pollard, who was on the 2007 Celtics when they won the title. He got a ring, doesn't look happy about it. And then there's Brian Cardinal, who was on the 2010 Mavericks when they won the title. He also got a ring. I'm guessing that you've probably never heard of the names I just mentioned: Brian Scalabrine, Isaiah Ryder, Scott Pollard, or Brian Cardinal. They're not as well known as, say, Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant. But just because they rode the bench more than they were actually on the court, every single one of them was on a team that won the championship title. So at the end of the season, as championship rings were being passed out to all the team members, even the lesser-known players, they all got their own rings. For the past few weeks, we've been in a sermon series that has looked at the 12 disciples, and so far we've looked at the names of some of the better-known disciples, the Kobe Bryants, the Magic Johnsons, the Michael Jordans, the guys with a lot of rings. But this morning we turn to the disciples we don't know very well, the disciples who didn't get much game time compared to their more famous teammates. Today we'll be looking at James the younger, Simon the zealot, and Judas, not to be confused with Judas Iscariot. Make no mistake, even though there's not a lot of stats for our three disciples this morning, they were all part of that championship team, and they were part of God's plan. Our first passage this morning comes from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 6, verses 12 and 13, which is a list of the 12 disciples. Luke chapter 6, verses 12 through 13 in your pew Bibles. It's on page 1106. Let us prepare our hearts and minds for the reading of God's word. The 12 disciples. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who is called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Our second passage is from John chapter 14, verses 21 through 23, and records the only known quote from Judas, not Judas Iscariot. John 14, 21 through 23. In your pew Bibles, it's on page 1158. The verse picks up with Jesus mid-sentence. Whoever has my command and obeys them, he is the one who loves me. He who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love him and show myself to him. Then Judas, not Judas Iscariot, said, "But Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not the world?" Jesus replied, "If anyone loves me, he will obey my teaching. My Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him." These are the words of the Lord. Thanks be to God. James the younger, Simon the zealot, and Judas, not Judas Iscariot. These are our three disciples for this morning. The Bible doesn't say anything about where these three disciples came from or what they did for a living. The Bible also doesn't tell us how they became disciples. Unlike Peter, Andrew, James, and John, who were all fishermen and were called while they were fishing, there's no backstory. There's no background information for these three. There's not even a call narrative or how they met Jesus. So if there are holes in my sermon this morning, if it sounds like I just made up a whole bunch of stuff about these three disciples, in my defense, there wasn't a whole lot to work with. So this is one of those Sunday mornings where I'm going to use my imagination and ask for some poetic license from the congregation. Would that be okay with you? Thank you. So let's begin with James. We are told in Luke chapter 6, in the listing of the 12 disciples, that James was the son of Alphaeus. There was another James on that list, the one that we're more familiar with, but that James was the brother of John, and their father's name was Zebedee. But this James was a different James because his father's name was Alphaeus. In order to tell these two Jameses apart, sometimes the Gospels refer to them as James the Greater, the James who was the brother of John. He was part of the inner circle. And James the Lesser, which is our James for today. In Mark's Gospel, James the Lesser was called James the Younger, which was another way of differentiating or distinguishing between the two James. Confusing, huh? Here at St. Mark's, we have several members who have the same first name, quite a few. Good example of that is the name Joan. We have 3 Joans here at St. Mark's. When I first got here, it was awfully confusing because I just called everyone Joan, and I was pretty good at that. But we have 3 Joans here at St. Mark's. Joan Dandoy, spelled exactly the way the other 2 like their names, but Joan Dandoy likes to be pronounced as Joanne. Then we have Joan Sundberg, who's here with us, and Joan Lopnow, who's teaching in the narthex. But it's easy to distinguish all 3 of them because they all have different last names. Well, they didn't have last names per se back in the first century, so if you had a lot of Jameses in your community, which they did because it was a fairly common name, you had to figure out a way how to distinguish each one of them. So the James we're looking at today was James the son of Alphaeus, or James the lesser of the 2 Jameses, or James the younger one. Let's all say the name James together. That's about as much as we know about disciple number 9. His name was James. Next. I'm kidding. The Bible doesn't say much about this disciple. We know that he was one of the 2 disciples for whom there are no recorded sayings. But not only was there an absence of any spoken words, there was also no special recognition or any display of leadership on the part of James. For example, in the famous story where the disciple Peter walked on water, James quietly stayed back in the boat. Or in another story where Jesus went up the mountain with Peter, James, and John, this James stayed back with the others down below. Even in the list of the disciples who went fishing with Peter after the resurrection, there were a bunch of names listed, but our James was not part of that group. James, the younger, was an obscure disciple who lived in the shadows of much more prominent disciples. If he said anything, it wasn't noteworthy. If he performed any miracles, it wasn't memorable. James was one of those people who seemed to prefer to stay behind the scenes. So just for fun, I tried to imagine what his call narrative might have been like, meaning what it might have been like when he first met Jesus. This is where you have to use your imagination. When James first met Jesus, Jesus said to him, "Come, follow me." James replied, "Sure, but what will I have to do?" Jesus answered, "You'll just have to follow." James then asked Jesus, "Will I have to walk on water?" Jesus said, "No." James then asked, "Will I have to perform any miracles?" Jesus said, "No." Then James said, "I'm not so good at public speaking. Will I have to speak in front of other people? I'm actually the quiet type, you know." And Jesus replied, "You'll be all right. Come, follow me." The Gospels don't actually record the call narrative of James, but I imagine that's how it kind of went down. James was a silent disciple. meaning in the Gospels, he didn't utter a single word that was ever recorded in any of the four Gospels. No known quote, no known heroic deed, no speaking parts. It's almost as if he took a vow of silence. James would have liked that quote from St. Francis of Assisi, the one that goes, "Preach the gospel all the time, and when necessary, use words." James would have also liked that verse, the one from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, particularly verse 7, the part that goes, "There is a time to be silent and a time to speak." Maybe just that first part. James apparently was a better listener than he was a talker. So when Jesus said the words, "I am the good shepherd, I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. My sheep listen to my voice, I know them, and they follow me," those words would have resonated with James. There's something to be said about the quiet part of our spiritual faith. In Eugene Peterson's book, A Long Obedience, listen to what he wrote about a quiet faith. "I will not run my own life or the lives of others. That's God's business. I will not pretend to invent the meaning of the universe. I will accept what God has sown its meaning to be. I will not noisily strut about demanding that I be treated as the center of my family or my neighborhood or my work, but seek to discover where I fit and what I am good at." That was James the Younger. Next, meet Simon the Zealot. There were two disciples also with the name Simon. There was Simon, who was better known as Peter, and there was this Simon known as Simon the Zealot. Simon the Zealot is the other disciple for whom there is no known recorded words, and together with James the Younger, these two disciples were silent. Let's take a moment to say Simon's name together. Simon. I find it very odd that for someone like Simon the Zealot, there were no known recorded words for anything he said. I find that odd because Simon was a zealot. Let me unpack that a little bit. Back in the first century, there were four basic parties for Jews. There were the Pharisees, whom we are very familiar with. They were kind of like the religious gatekeepers with their strict adherence and application of the law. Then there were the Sadducees, who tended to be a little bit more progressive. They were the wealthy upper class. They were also in charge of the temple. These first two, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, made up the Sanhedrin, the highest ruling body. But then there were two other parties. There were the Essenes. They're not mentioned in Scripture. The Essenes kind of shunned organized religion, if you will. They were highly critical of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and so they said, well, they didn't say, but then they retreated out into the wilderness kind of to get away from it all. The fourth party were the Zealots. Simon was one of them, and let me tell you, the Zealots, they were an explosive group. The Zealots in Jesus' day were the most politically minded among all four parties. They had strong anti-Roman sentiments or leanings, and they channeled most, if not all, of their energy in an effort to overthrow Rome. Their main objective was to restore Israel's sovereignty, and that meant by any means necessary, including physical violence, even assassination of Roman officials. Zealots were the freedom fighters of their day. They were militant. They showed up in big numbers at protests, not necessarily peaceful protests, and a particular group of zealots were known as the Sicarii, named after the small daggers that they hid underneath their cloaks. The zealots were not peaceful. They were not what you would call pacifists. If you asked them to do something, they wouldn't kind of lean back and say, let me pray about that for a day or two. They didn't form committees. They didn't commission task forces. They took matters into their own hands, if you know what I mean. That's why it's surprising that the Gospels don't record a single word that Simon the Zealot might have said, because out of all the disciples, it would have been Simon who was the most vocal. My guess is that maybe the words that did come out of his mouth were maybe inappropriate, maybe R-rated, not appropriate for general audiences. What's interesting about someone like Simon the Zealot becoming one of the 12 disciples is that he was the polar opposite on the political spectrum of the other disciple named Matthew. From last week, remember Matthew the tax collector? He collected taxes from his own people and sent them off to Rome. But Simon the Zealot was the antithesis of Matthew. It's actually a surprise Simon didn't kill Matthew, if you kind of see the tension there. Matthew was the tax collector. Simon would have been a tax evader. The two were as opposite as night and day. So how did someone like Simon the Zealot even become a disciple? The Bible doesn't say. So I tried to imagine how it would have gone down. When Simon first met Jesus, Jesus said to Simon, "Come, follow me. We're going to establish God's kingdom." Simon replied, "You mean we're going to restore Israel to her former glory?" Jesus replied, "Not exactly." Simon then asked Jesus, "Will there be any battles? Are we going off to war?" Jesus replied, "Not quite." Simon then asked, "Will we be rising up against Rome? Will I get to see any action?" Jesus said to Simon, "There will be none of that." Simon then asked Jesus, "How about any nighttime raids under the cover of darkness?" Jesus answered, "Sorry, Simon, there will be no raids under the cover of darkness. We are children of light, and our best work is done during the day." Simon replied, "Oh, I see." A few commentaries remarked that it's actually a surprise that it was Judas Iscariot and not Simon the Zealot who ended up betraying Jesus, because when the rebellion didn't start and when the revolution didn't get underway in Jerusalem, it would have more likely been Simon the Zealot who was thoroughly disappointed in Jesus. All his hopes and dreams for the restoration of Israel hanging there on a cross in shame. So what happened? How does a guy like Simon the Zealot not manage to kill Matthew, not manage to get crucified next to Jesus? What happened to his zeal or his passion for his people? The Gospels don't record it, but somewhere along the line and somewhere along the ministry, maybe it was in a small village where the people were spiritually hungry. Maybe it was on a mountainside seeing Jesus feed the multitudes, or maybe it was listening to parable after parable where Jesus talked about the kingdom of heaven, and something finally clicked. Simon finally understood that the enemy was never Rome, that we were the enemies of God, and that the real battle was the one Jesus won on the cross of salvation. Our final disciple this morning is the disciple named Judas. He is not to be confused with the disciple known as Judas Iscariot. That was the Judas who betrayed Jesus, and so as not to confuse the two, in John's gospel, this Judas is described as Judas, not Iscariot. How did Judas, not Iscariot, become a disciple? This is how I imagine it went down. When Judas first met Jesus, Jesus said to him, "Come, follow me." Judas replied, "Me? Really? This is going to be exciting. I've never done anything like this before." Jesus replied, "Me too." Judas then asked Jesus, "Will it just be you and me? Will there be others on our team?" Jesus answered, "Oh, there will be others." Judas then said, "Wow, will I know any of them? Who else will be on our team?" Jesus answered, "Well, let's see. There's Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Nathaniel, Matthew, Thomas. There's another James. There's another Simon. There's a guy named Judas Iscariot. And then there's you." Judas then asked, "Did you say there's already a guy named Judas?" Jesus answered, "Why, yes, there is. Is there a problem?" Judas then asked, "Won't that get confusing because my name is Judas too?" Jesus then said, "You're right. Do you happen to have another name?" Judas replied, "Well, some people call me Thaddeus." Jesus answered, "Thaddeus sounds great. We'll have to call you that from now on." That was Judas's other name. He often went by Thaddeus, so please say the name Thaddeus with me. Thaddeus. Unlike James the Younger and Simon the Zealot, Thaddeus actually said a few words in the Bible. He asked Jesus a question that was recorded in John chapter 14. In John 14, to set the context quickly, Jesus was with his disciples in the upper room. They were observing Passover when the disciples started asking Jesus a series of questions. Peter was the first disciple to raise his hand, and his question was this: "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus responded to Peter by saying, "Where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." Then it was Thomas's turn to ask the next question: "Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way?" Jesus responded to Thomas by saying, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Next, it was Philip's turn to ask the next question: "Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough." Jesus responded to Philip by saying, "Don't you know me, Philip, even after I've been among you such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and that the Father is in me? The words I say to you are not just my own. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work." By the way, Jesus was just getting going into his response to Philip and continues on for 9 more verses with his response. "Whoever has my command and obeys them, he is the one who loves me. He who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love him and show myself to him." By this time, I imagine all the disciples were not making eye contact with Jesus anymore. They were just staring down at the leftovers on the Passover table, or they were looking down on the ground or at their sandals, because what was happening, if you notice, was for every question that the disciple asked, Jesus' response was getting longer and longer. So, by this time, the disciples were all looking at their watches, probably thinking the same thing. "Okay, guys, no one ask him any more questions." But that's when Thaddeus' hand went up. And you could almost imagine all the other disciples trying to shoo his hand down, telling him to put his hand away. But Thaddeus didn't get the message. Jesus, I have one more question. Thaddeus, Jesus said. Thaddeus? Wow, you speak? What's your question? Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world? He asked. Jesus, smiling, great question. I'm so glad you asked. Jesus' response, by the way, took up the rest of their time in the upper room, took up several chapters to answer, and that was the final question that was asked of him that night. By the way, the final question before he was crucified. A closer look at Thaddeus' question showed his concern not just for present company, but his concern for the rest of the world. Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world? Thaddeus was concerned for not just his own situation, but for the situation of others. Why just us? Why not the world? That was Thaddeus, whose other name was Judas. James the younger, Simon the Zealot, and Judas, not Iscariot, these were our disciples for today. What happened to these three? James the younger was thought to have brought the gospel message all the way to Syria and Persia, where there he was martyred for his faith, and in some circles, James is considered the patron saint of the dying as well as pharmacists. I wasn't able to make the connection. Simon the Zealot was said to have taken the gospel north and preached to the British Isles, and like the other disciples, he simply disappeared from the Bible records. But all accounts say that he too was martyred for his faith, believed to have been sawed in half. So for that reason, in some religious circles, Simon is the patron saint of woodcutters, sawyers, curriers, and tanners. A little gruesome. Judas, not Iscariot, also known as Thaddeus, was said to have taken the gospel to what is modern-day Turkey, where he healed the king of Edessa, a man by the name of Abgar, who was thought to have a terminal, incurable disease. So for that reason, Judas is considered the patron saint of lost causes, hopeless causes, and is often depicted in pictures with an axe over his head, which is believed to be the instrument by which he was martyred. We've looked at 11 of the 12 disciples, the original 12 disciples. We have one disciple left, whom we'll look at next week. I pray that as you go into this week, may our 3 disciples inspire and guide you. These 3 disciples didn't say much, if anything at all. They were not well known and often served in the background. They were not famous. They were not leaders among the 12, but they played their part in serving our Lord Jesus Christ, often in obscurity. This week, as we too walk with and follow Christ, let us do so not for fame or glory, nor for laud or praise, but for the one who called us and continues to walk before us. And all God's people said, Amen.